Hi there, John Wilkinson and History Made Easier. This video is going to take a look at comparing the ways in which the bad boys, Mussolini, Lenin, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, comparing the way they held on to power, the way they gained power and held on to power. And I came up with this idea of comparing them or thinking about them as poker players. And it's a tricky analogy for me because I don't play cards. I certainly don't understand what's a winning hand in poker. But like all of us, I guess, I've seen, the movies of poker players, and you can see those guys who seem to have an astute, disciplined approach to this, and those who gamble recklessly and lose all their money and make a mess of their lives. So I thought it would be interesting to think of our leaders of authoritarian states, our bad boys as I like to think of them, as poker players. So here's my analysis of Mussolini and co. And I'm going to take it from what I think is probably the poker player that you would want to be pitted against, the one you might win some money from, to the one that you really don't want to sit down with. So I'm going to begin with Mussolini. Now, to be fair to Mussolini, I think he probably had consistently a bad hand of cards. He never really was in a good position to play this game. But I would also say that he was prepared to kind of recklessly throw his chips into the middle of the table when he really should have known better. Give him credit. He did throw in his cards on one occasion. That's when he decided to drop socialism and take up fascism as a better way to achieving power. Give him credit for that. Nevertheless, I think Mussolini was mostly reckless and ill-considered in the way he approached his poker game. He allowed his heart to rule over his head. He wanted Italy to be a great power too much. He didn't really see the reality that was there before him. He thought he saw the new fascist man when he didn't really exist. And he took Italy into a war that he couldn't win, or it couldn't win, Italy couldn't win. He allowed himself to get carried away with Hitler's more exciting foreign policy. But Hitler had a better hand of cards to play with. So I would put Mussolini as not a great poker player, I don't think. And I suppose we should conclude that he did end up shot and hung upside down, which is not very dignified, in a Milan petrol station. Again, not very dignified. So I think overall, not a great poker player. Who would I go to next? I would go for Lenin next, which might surprise you, but I would go for Lenin next. He was actually a very good chess player. And so he would have had a strong notion of strategy and a strong notion of probing the weaknesses of his fellow card players. But ultimately, I think he was too passionate, a very emotional communist, a very passionate communist. He was the man of fiery speeches, the man of thumping the table. He even threatened to resign over the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He did fight a good fight, and he did convince his fellow Bolsheviks consistently. But I don't know if he would make a great poker player. Let's think of how he played his hand. He was really convinced, without a lot of evidence. He hadn't lived in Russia for a long, long time, and yet he remained convinced that a Bolshevik revolution, a second revolution, would succeed. He may have been lucky in gaining power, and he certainly held a debt to the likes of Trotsky and others who helped organize the revolution. And maybe he did see a weakness in the provisional government that others didn't fully realize, but I think it was a gamble. And certainly his fellow Bolsheviks thought it was a gamble and were very uneasy about that gamble. I would give him credit that many historians felt that he manipulated events to bring about a civil war in order to get rid of opponents to Bolshevism once and for all. He ruthlessly got rid of the Constituent Assembly. He pushed through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that he knew would be unpopular from the right, what was remaining of the right in Russia. So he did, I would give him credit for that. He showed a ruthlessness there. He played his cards well in that respect. Though again, winning the Civil War was by no means a certainty. And again, he owed an awful lot to Trotsky. But on the other hand, he was prepared to play safe when his cards were not that good. He'd throw the cards onto the table, I suppose, and get out of the game when he thought they weren't strong enough. And I'm thinking of the nationalist question. I'm thinking of his step backwards with the NEP. So, maybe he was a better card player than I might be giving him credit for, but I'm still going to place him second. Ultimately, he left a party that was not united and didn't have a clear idea of what direction it would now go and who would lead it. And so I'm going to put him after Mussolini, but down the pecking order. I don't know if I would play poker against any of them, but if I think I was to have a chance, then Mussolini or Lenin might be the guys I would pit myself against. Who I would next place in this pecking order would be Hitler. He laid his cards on the table for everyone to see, with his speeches and Mein Kampf that really set out his plans. They were all there for people to see. Not the best strategy for a game of poker, I don't think. And yet I still put him ahead of Musso and Lenin. So he told the world what he would do. But on the other hand, he did preach peace in many of his speeches, trying to ease the tensions after he'd got what he wanted at each step of the game. Anschluss is enough for us Germans. Oh, but now we want the Sudetenland, but that will be enough for us Germans. And so he did play a clever game, maybe. But what else would I say? He showed a ruthlessness as well. We only have to go to the Night of the Long Knives to see that. Gleichschaltung, ruthless throughout, determined, ruthless, focused, knew what he wanted, determined to get there. So, maybe a good poker player. And he certainly was unprincipled. He did his deal with Stalin, Nazi-Soviet pact, knowing all the time that he was going to break it, and break it he did. But then, ultimately, in IGCSE, if you guys did IGCSE, you will remember that there's the great debate about whether Hitler was a planner or a gambler, and ultimately he did gamble. He gambled right back with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. He himself is on record as saying it was the most nerve-wracking 48 hours of his life. And then, of course, he made the gamble that led to his downfall, the invasion of the Soviet Union. We have to reflect that ultimately Hitler commits suicide in his bunker, with Germany invaded from both west and east. Germany bombed to smithereens, German women being raped in their tens of thousands by Soviet troops. And so ultimately his gambling didn't pay off. So I put him middle ranking, but not up with Mao and Stalin. So, who comes next? Well, for me, it would be Mao. Words like astute, cunning, ruthless, these are the words that come to mind when we look at the way Mao dealt his hand. But Mao also had a reckless streak in him too. The kind of astute, ruthless, cunning side of Mao we see before he gains power. For example, the rectification campaigns at Yan'an that encouraged people to admit their mistakes, their deviations from the true Marxist line, only to be stamped on good and hard when having done so. And we see it also in the Let 1,000 or 100 Flowers Bloom campaign, which did exactly the same thing. Encourage people to admit to their deviance, to suggest other ways to achieve socialism in China, only to be ruthlessly dealt with, having come out and admitted their sins. So we see that kind of cunning ruthlessness with Mao. But we also see a recklessness. We see it with the Great Leap Forward, and I have to say the utter nonsense of the backyard furnaces. A crazy idea that you can build a mighty industrial nation with people heating up their scrap iron in their backyards. Not a great idea. And we see it also with the Cultural Revolution that just created the biggest chaos I think a nation has ever been through. Just utter chaos. So we see a recklessness, and yet we have to give credit that Mao was a survivor, and Mao stayed in power right to the very end. So maybe Mao was a good poker player. Well, I think he was, but he made mistakes. And so we come, for me, the poker player, the one you do not want to sit down with. You'll lose all your money, I think. And that, of course, is Stalin. Like Mao, astute, cunning, ruthless. I think also, like Mao, I could have added cold and calculating, but able to make mistakes as well. But less so, I think, though it was a big mistake he made. We see his cunning and ruthlessness, etc., in his rise to power. The way he played off the other players around the table, using Kamenev and Zinoviev to see off Trotsky, then turning on them, using Bukharin in the process, and then turning on Bukharin until he's the last man sitting round the table. All the chips gathered in front of him. But we also see it as well in his once he's in power, in his purges of the party, though we might also add to that it was a sign of insecurity in his game plan. It certainly left the Soviet Union very much weakened when Hitler invaded. And that's where we come, I think, to Stalin's big mistake, his stubbornness, his inability to see the evidence that everyone else was seeing, that Hitler was planning to invade. The Germans were gathering on the border, and Stalin just refused to see the signs. Not a good sign of a poker player, I think, in that instance. But he did recover. He did recover from that. And like Mao, he dies in power, still in power. So I think none of them are flawless. They all give us a chance to earn some chips of our own, some money. But I think all of them I would advise not to play against. I wouldn't have played against them. But I think out of all of them, it's Stalin that I would have avoided. I just wouldn't have played against Stalin. He was the one that, my goodness me, you couldn't read his mind. You wouldn't know what cards he had in front of him. You would be second guessing. So I hope that little kind of play with the analogy of poker gives us a useful insight into the way those authoritarian leaders stayed in power, the way they played their cards and stayed in power for quite some time, all of them, for quite a lengthy period. Ended badly for some of them, but nevertheless, they played their cards well until it came crashing down. So, there you go. I hope it was useful, but as always, I say thank you for listening, and take a look at my website, historymadeeasier.com. Cheers.